Today on Locked On Canadiens, why we should not be worrying about Filip Mesar, what happened to Jan Mysak, and what is the greatest need in the Montreal Canadiens scouting department.
You are Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 892 of your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel Sportsbook, the official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more and visit fanduel.com/lockedon today to get started. My name is Laura Saba, and also known as the Active Stick, and I'm not joined today by my wonderful co-host Scott Matla. Instead, I am joined by the wonderful Hadi, Kalakeche, and Sebastian of the Locked On NHL Prospects podcast. Their work can also be found on Dobber Prospects. Sebastian is the head scout and the director of European scouting, and Hadi is the director of North American scouting at Dobber Prospects. Hadi's work can also be found on Habs Eyes on the Prize. Today we talk about Filip Mesar and why people need to stop writing him off. We also wonder or ponder, or I ask the question, what happened to Jan Mysak? And then we have listener questions. And today, the portion that I've left in this episode is mostly to do with needs in the Montreal Canadiens scouting department. So without further ado, here's Sebastian and Hadi. Speaking of individual positions, I do want to talk a little bit about Filip Mesar. We've been a very defenseman-heavy conversation thus far, but I wanted to really use your expertise to talk about things that maybe Habs fans, questions that Habs fans really have. We've talked so much about so many other prospects and things like that, but Filip Mesar to me is a huge question mark because it wasn't completely out of nowhere when the Canadiens drafted him, but it was kind of a surprise, right? We didn't think that that's the direction that they would have been going in. And I think one thing that's kind of really had given Canadiens fans pause is the year that he had. But from talking to you guys as well as other, public scouting experts, it feels like Filip Mesar was not necessarily on the optimal team for him to be making progress, right?
No,
and
not even
I'm
slightly.
trying to be nice. It was not a good team. Let's just say that.
I think he went through 3 coaches last year or something like that. It was rough.
It wasn't a great environment. I think both me and Hadi are bigger fans of Mesar than the average public scout. So that just putting that out there that is our perspective. I like the pick.
I have a question though.
Yes.
Is it because we're all Habs fans?
No, because I mean, look, I had Mesar ranked 18th overall in 2020.
Yeah, I had him in the same range approximately.
I thought getting him at 26 was good value. It wasn't like, oh my god, amazing pick value in my view, but it was really solid.
And it wasn't a reach.
Not from my perspective. I mean, I would have picked Brad Lambert. I would have been sprinting to the podium to draft Brad Lambert, but Filip Mesar I thought was a good pick. And while yes, my view has perhaps diminished a little bit in the last year, I think a lot of Habs fans are completely writing him off. This is a bust. He will never play for the Habs. It's really intense. And this is all after there were multiple articles written on Filip Mesar, the first round draft pick with the least pressure in Habs history after he was picked because he wasn't the first overall pick, right? So Slavkovsky has all the pressure, therefore Mesar will have none. And then a year later, and seemingly unanimously, the Habs fan base has written him off. And I think that's a real overcorrection. Yes, his year wasn't amazing. You can look at the raw stats and be like, that's not ideal. Yeah. However, look, in terms of chance generation, in terms of primary assists and passes to the slot, Filip Mesar was among the top 3 in the entire OHL this season. Yeah. He really elevated his playmaking game. I thought in his draft year, he was at his best kind of in the bumper role as a one-time option. I thought his shot was a little bit better than his playmaking. that completely changed the D+1. I thought his playmaking really took some steps, and the goal scoring kind of petered off a little bit. It wasn't quite as strong as in his draft year. But I thought his defensive game was okay. I thought he really worked on his physicality in small areas, and that's all part of adapting to the North American ice. Despite going from a pro league to a junior one, he had to get used to having less space to work with. Yes, he perhaps has a bit more time, but he has less space, and that is something that he had to adapt to. I definitely think he should be in the AHL this season. I don't think the OHL any longer would be too good for his confidence at this point. I think that was an experiment that could have worked well if it hadn't been Kitchener. But I think in the AHL he will be in a pro system, and he's the type of player that, in my view, relies on having teammates that are at his level. He's not the type of player that will be carrying a line, but he can really complement a line very, very well. And I think he still has middle six potential as a really good complementary piece rather than an offensive driver. So if you put him in the role in the AHL with players like Riley Kidney or Joshua Roy, or Ylonen should be in the NHL this year, but
hopefully.
But Laval will have a decent amount of offensive talent and young talent, like raw skill. I would put Mesar right in with that. I would maybe even consider giving Slafkovsky a bit of time in Laval, maybe putting him on a line with Mesar. I think that could be fun for both of them. I also think Slafkovsky would benefit from having a bit of an opportunity to take control of some games. But yeah, I think there are options with Mesar, but I think the AHL is the ideal one.
Yeah, no, fully agreed there. For me, the two things that stood out majorly in Mesar's game in his draft here were his anticipation and his skating. And he's been put in situations in Kitchener where he hasn't been able to flash either of those skills. So right now, what I'm looking at for Mesar is I want him to be able to carry the puck up the ice, to make reads off the puck, to get into pockets of space. The main thing, like Sebastian said, in his draft year, you really saw his shots stand out because he was so good at finding space off the puck. He was so good at hitting pockets of space at just the right time and getting shots off quickly. But he can incorporate that anticipation into his playmaking game as well. He can anticipate his teammates' routes just the same way that he would do them, but he needs teammates that think the game like he does, and he just doesn't have that in Kitchener right now. He played a bit of the year with Francesco Pinelli, who's a really, really good OHL player.
And very, very smart.
Very intelligent, but outside of that, when he was dropped to the third line, when he was dropped to the fourth line, you saw a big difference, and he was throwing pucks to the slot in decent ways and very intelligent ways, but there was no one there to convert. So playing in the AHL, especially in a top six with guys who have that intelligence, who have that awareness, who can think the game at his level, anticipate the game at his level, is just going to be so good for his game. And like Sebastian said, I feel like a lot of the fan base has written him off just because he had a bad year on a bad team. But I feel like if you put him on any other OHL team with a bit more firepower, with a bit more, offensive drive in terms of the guys that can carry the puck up the ice, that can hit those pockets of space, I feel like you would see a completely different Filip Mesar.
And I think that's what I think this year will be very telling. And I feel like I think he's going to come a long way in Habs fans' eyes this year.
Yep.
I think he confirmed that he's been promised he's going to be played in Laval. I haven't heard anything from the organization though. But I would really hope that they don't send him back to a situation like that.
Yeah.
I mean, if I were Mesar, I'd just be like, I'm not signing with the Canadiens. I'm never signing back with you guys. That's just my opinion, but I think that Laval is a great place for him. And I also think that it'll give him an opportunity to kind of endear himself to the fan base, which isn't exactly his role, right? Like his role is to develop to his best ability. But I think like if I see flashes of what you were talking about, right? Like that anticipation, and all of that, like I think it's just going to be so exciting for Canadiens fans. I feel really bad just because like he's always kind of seemed like an afterthought or a question mark or like what were the Canadiens doing. But I feel really encouraged by the fact that you both had him ranked as high as you did last year pre-draft. And I also I think one of the other things too is that like when you draft a player, you were talking about D+1 years, like there's expectations as to where they're going to be at the end of the year. The fact that he didn't reach them aren't his fault in this scenario. Usually it's a combination of player and situation. In this case, I feel like that situation was just so like dragged him down so far that any progress he would have made has been canceled out by the context, right?
Yeah, and I mean, there's also this whole Jan Mysak shell shock thing going on with the Habs fan base, where just people think that, because Jan Mysak was more or less rushed into, he was kind of stuck on a team where he wasn't playing an offensive role, he was playing a shutdown role, and then when he hit the AHL, he wasn't able to keep up because he was kind of forced into a role that didn't bring out the best element of his game, didn't make him face the best scenarios to improve those kind of areas of his game. That this is going to be the same with Mesar, but Mesar is already just a foundationally better skater overall than Mesar by far.
He's already a better player than Mesar is now. Than Mysak. God, yeah. Another reason that I think that those comparisons are made is because their names are similar. I mean, if I'm mixing them up right now.
Yeah.
Not ideal.
It's like it was a scouting report on Mysak and everybody thought it was Mesar all along.
Yeah.
I have so much more coming up with Sebastian and Hadi. But first, this episode is brought to you by FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook for a reason. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel and get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets, up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over/under to who you think is going to get the first home run. All on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. There's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. So sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, the official partner of Major League Baseball and Locked On.
Yeah, see, that's the thing. Like, I feel like there's this kind of shell shock going on regarding that player and how he developed, but it's just such a unique development curve. And yes, Mesar is following the same path of going from a pro team in Central Europe to going to the OHL and then hopefully AHL, and that's scaring people off. But for me, it's important for a player to get to the level where they're going to stay and develop as much as possible, because we've seen it with a guy like God, I forget his name. He was a bust that was drafted 11th overall by the Habs in 2010. Louis Leblanc. Yeah, we saw how bad it is for a player to go. I think LeBlanc played in 4 leagues in 3 years, which was just terrible for his development because he wasn't able to develop consistency.
You need consistency.
Exactly.
You need stability, I think.
Exactly.
Yeah,
for sure. And Mesar certainly needs that, but I feel like in his situation right now, I feel like if he goes to the AHL and then they're like, oh, he's not good enough, let's send him back to the OHL, that'll be terrible for him. But if they stick with him in the AHL for a whole year and then a second or even a third year in the AHL, you'll see a very different Jan Mysak by the end. Filip Mesar by the end of it. See, we mixed it up again.
We both did it.
Exactly. So yeah, you'll see a completely different player by year 3. But if you're just consistently just throwing him up and down lineups and playing him in leagues that he has no business playing in, then he's not going to develop the way he can. It's just I feel like there's a lot of galaxy braining happening with prospects sometimes, and just like simplifying things, just being like, okay, this player needs consistency and stability, let's give him that, but not at a level where he's not getting the teammates he needs. Yeah. It doesn't have to be any more complicated than that, I feel.
And I think sorry, go on.
I would love to see Laval kind of stick him with a stable line mate as well, and kind of stick them together. I think that Mesar and Riley Kidney would be an excellent fit in terms of pace and speed and skill and intelligence. You'd have to have a third line mate there that can pick up the pieces defensively a little bit, at least to start, and insulate them a bit, both physically and defensively. But I think that those two could work really nicely. And Laval has a lot of players that I think could fit in that role. Like even like a guy like Lucas Condata, I think could be quite solid in that type of
Mitchell Stevens, Joshua Roy, even
Joshua Roy. That would be my preferred one, but I don't know if they're going to do a kid line on a second line, but I'd love to see it.
So I did want to really quickly, because I know we want to get onto the listener questions, and I've had you guys on for so long. Really quickly, Jan Mysak. Everybody's kind of lost hope. Do you think it's something? It's a ship that can be righted?
Not really.
No.
At this point, like I think his 19-year-old season, well, barely season, but where he was in the AHL for half the year, I think that did some damage that just hasn't been rectified. Like I think like last season was for me the last year where I was like, if he turns it around now, I think there's still a straightforward path, but he would have needed to get a top 6 opportunity. And he would have had to like really stick with it. And he got, I think, a couple games in the top 6, but they were really few and far between. And in the end, he had what, like 10 points in the season in the AHL as like, and he's what, 21, 22 now. The skill is still there. There's still these flashes of the player that the Habs drafted, but it was a really, really unfortunate circumstance. And I think that of all the Habs prospects, or even players in general, I don't know if on like a professional standpoint, if anyone suffered more from the pandemic than Jan Mysak.
Yeah.
Which really sucks, honestly.
Sure.
Like, I feel so bad because like he seems
agree.
like such a positive kid, and
everyone
like,
loves him. Every teammate adores him. Like every interview you have where teammates talk about him, they love him. It really sucks, and I really hope he proves me wrong on kind of writing him off now at this stage in his career.
I hope so too. All right, let's get to Canadiens fans' questions for you guys. Randy Hansen asks, does anyone know if the Habs still have a private combine in Europe to get a good look at undrafted players? So I got asked this and started like researching it, and I couldn't find anything about even a previous version of this.
There was. They discovered Romanov in that combine.
Yeah.
I think that was a thing of the Bergevin era. I don't think it's been continued since, from what I've heard, unless they're doing it super like low down. Where, I mean, I think that me and Hadi are pretty in touch in terms of like the merger of scouting and Habs, where I don't think. I mean, Hadi, have you heard of this continuing? Because if we both haven't, I doubt it is.
I wouldn't put it past the Habs
True.
to have continued it, but I haven't heard anything since the whole Romanov spiel about this.
Yeah.
So yeah,
it would have been pre-pandemic.
Yeah.
All right. So Randy has another question, and this is a very subjective question. What is currently the most pressing need in the scouting department? So let's say amateur scouting, because that's your baby. Like, let's forget about pro scouting. What do you think?
I think the pro scouting is a lot stronger for the Habs. But yeah, I mean, how do you start? I need to collect my thoughts on this one.
I'd say, I mean, they've added a lot of great people in the amateur scouting side. I think that Chris Boucher's been doing a fantastic job in terms of kind of quantifying and verbalizing a lot of the kind of more mathematical things in hockey to the scouting fan base, to the scouting base rather of the Habs. But for me, I feel like a big concern is I don't think there's a strong enough voice in the Habs kind of scouting staff regarding kind of shouldering Chris Boucher in terms of analytics, in terms of getting into the more in-depth analysis of kind of projections of what skills work at the NHL level, because there's a lot of the picks that they made, not just this year, but even last year, 2 years ago, there were some picks, especially at the top end, where I felt like a lot of it was Nick Bobrov kind of just pushing for the guy that he likes and making the closing argument on that. I'm thinking of Slafkovsky, obviously Reinbacher this year. The later round picks I felt were more kind of free form and were more kind of a general consensus of the scouts. But I feel like just decentralizing the first pick in the draft would be so important, because I feel like if you gave a voice to some of the other guys in the locker room, you would probably have seen a Zach Benson or a Matvei Michkov picked at 5th overall. I wouldn't be surprised at all. So just having someone else to shoulder the scouting staff, to uplift their voices, to make sure that it's not a single person decision at the end of the day for the 1st overall pick or the 5th overall pick or that kind of thing, because those picks are important. You get them once in a decade, hopefully. Yeah. So, you want to hit on those picks, and you don't want the safe pick. You want to hit for, the Habs have been missing an 80+ point guy for the past 20 years. Mm-hmm. So I feel like it's a it's about time that kind of the ship is steered in that direction so that we can get that elite player no matter where we pick him. But usually you don't get those guys outside of the top 5, and when you have two top 5 picks in the last 2 drafts and you don't leave the draft with one guy who's projected to be an 80+ point guy, it's a struggle. And that's something that I feel like is a pressing need in the scouting department, just to have more of a focus on upside and have more people in there in order to give their voices and to make it less of a kind of one-man show in terms of who gets picked in that top 5.
And now here's more with Hadi, Kalakeche, and Sebastian High of Locked On NHL Prospects.
I agree. I think my biggest criticism would be communication, both internally and externally. My sense has been that there's a little bit of a, as Hadi kind of said, a bit of a power imbalance within the scouting staff, because every interview you have with like Kent Hughes and Jeff Gorton is all about, we want communication, we want all of the arms of this organization to be working together. Amateur scouting is the one place where I'm not seeing that happen at all. Like the drafts, I don't find are overly coherent. And if you had an entire staff doing it together entirely, I think it would be a bit more coherent than it is. Like a bit more, like right now we're seeing, like I was floored by the Habs draft like this year. Like I was quite stunned, and as were all the public scouts sitting around me at the draft. Like we were all kind of like looking around like, are we seeing the same thing? Just because it was so dramatically different from 2022, and it's the same scouting staff, right? And when you have that inconsistency in perhaps that internal communication, at the very least, you need to communicate to the fans very, very clearly as to why you're making these decisions. And I thought that the Habs press conference with their head scouts was bad. I think a lot of the fan frustration boiled down from that, in terms of their message was basically, we like this guy, we pick him. And then the next pick, oh, we like him, we pick him, right? If you were to really delve down into the details, saying, we picked David Reinbacher because A, B, C, D, right? Like, we love this. We think that we can build him into a really effective top 4 piece, perhaps in terms of this style is kind of what we're thinking. I think transparency in terms of the draft would be really, really useful in terms of mitigating fan frustration. And I think that one of the reasons that the Habs fan base lashed out so viciously after the draft was because the organization gave them nothing. They didn't give them any real explanations. Like, it was all very wishy-washy. Like, they didn't communicate any of their actual scouting reasons for picking the players that they picked. It was entirely character-based in terms of what they were saying. I think, look, if you were to say, if they had picked Reinbacher and their entire draft class as they did, but they went out and every single pick, they give a clear outline. This is why we're hopeful, and this is why we're taking that risk at the spot. I can understand it. I think I would have a lot of respect for a team being gutsy enough to do that. What bugged me, and what I think bugs a lot of fans, is that they just didn't communicate. And I think that their communication skills internally may not be a whole lot better than their communication skills with the fan base on that one standpoint. So at the very least, maybe adding like some media people that are connected with the amateur scouting staff to kind of communicate better to the fan base why they're making decisions that they're making. But yeah, I think communication as a whole is the thing that's mainly lacking here, because look, fans want some consistency, and the draft was not exactly consistent with either what the scouts have said in the past or what the Habs front office has said their idea is to build this team. Like, as we've discussed, the Habs have a ton of depth in terms of prospects and in the NHL. Like, there's no concern about what the Habs' future bottom 6 is, or their future bottom pairing, or backup goaltending. I think all that's pretty much set. So why are you spending your third pick of the draft on a D+1 who went under half a point a game in the OHL as a forward? Right? Like, if you make that pick, and I think it's a beautiful storyline for the Jackeye family, that like these are two amazing underdog stories. They're ending up with their favorite teams. It's an immigrant family. I think it's all amazing and beautiful. But the team still had to communicate to the fans this is not just a pick of this being the brother of Arbor Jacki. This is why we're picking Florian. And they never did. They just said, oh, good character, intense, and left it at that.
Yeah.
And I think there's an issue with that.
And how demoralizing is that as well for the players, where their team isn't even selling them to their fan base?
I agree.
I feel like it would be a lot more moralizing for the prospects getting picked to be like, oh, this team likes me for these reasons. Let me build off of that.
Everyone involved.
Exactly.
Like, I think the Habs have like they had kind of a trend of being more transparent with some things. But they've really, really dialed that back, and there's been a real lack of transparency. And I think there's a lot of frustration boiling from that.
Yeah,
I would absolutely agree. You know who's like the last couple of drafts I've really, really enjoyed is Buffalo, which pains me to say because they're going to be in the division and contending at the same time.
Good.
Buffalo's really been, yeah.
Them and Carolina, of course, but Carolina's Carolina.
There's a few teams that have been drafting excellently recently.
Yes, yeah. And I would like the Canadiens to be consistent in that department because I really liked their draft last year. The 2022, I loved it. Again, it was like a little bit all over the place in terms of decisions. There was no unifying identity like there is with some of these other teams, which is fine. Like thinking outside the box is fine. I do want to get to a couple more questions. There's some longer ones, which we'll leave for another day, but I want to get to a couple more questions just because I don't want to keep you guys too much longer. So here's a question from listener Kenneth. I have a question for the prospect experts. What prospects with a high upside that other teams are down on or losing interest in could the Habs pick up cheap and have a change of scenery help them achieve their potential? So in all of your scouting and all of your prospect work, is there somebody who's currently, I guess, belongs to another team that maybe isn't getting as much of a fair shake by their team that the Habs could take advantage of?
My answer would have been Matthew Phillips last year, but he's in Washington now and he's probably going to get a shot. It's a tough one.
Can I go with Francesco Pinelli? I feel like he's kind of getting buried a bit in the LA Kings prospect pool, and I feel like he's one of the smartest players I've watched ever. He's so really intelligent, and you add on top of that his goal scoring ability. You add on top of that his playmaking game, and it's just all he's really missing is an extra gear of skating. And I feel like a team like the Leafs would just, I mean, if they trade, I don't know, a third round pick or a second round pick for Frankie Pinelli, get him in their system, have Barb Underhill work with him for like 2-3 years, you might get a top 6 player. There's guys like that I think are getting severely undervalued and overlooked, in certain prospect pools that you can kind of bank on that. I feel like Carolina could do away with some of their prospects. I feel like they would be willing to trade a Gleb Cherkasov or, a Jaden Perron even after the draft, that kind of thing for
Jackson Blake, maybe.
Jackson Blake would be also great value. There's guys like that you can find in almost every prospect pool. All you need to do is just be confident in your amateur scouting department and
be patient.
Yeah, exactly. And there's a lot of teams that have a lot of prospect depth that they could do away with one of these guys and not be too worried about it, and they could get some draft capital out of it. So there's value here and there. I wouldn't say there's any names that really stand out massively, but
in terms of high upside, I think it's tougher. And I think also why the Habs aren't entirely in the market for these types of deals, because again, they have depth, and these are the types of deals where you're trying to buy low on players that might have like a smidgen of that top 6 upside or top 4 upside, but it's just not that slam dunk, because usually when players are like 21, 22, it's pretty clear to most people and like scouts and fans alike if they have a reasonable chance at that type of role or not. I think one name I'll throw out there as an option would be Sean Behrens. I think Sean Behrens, his production dropped off last season, but he's a really mobile offensive defenseman, exceptional playmaker, and
really physical for his size too.
Really
he's
physical,
tiny, but he's so feisty.
He's intelligent. He plays through pressure really well. He's a solid enough in zone defender. He's really fun. And I think that with him, you can get a second pairing, a potential second pairing defenseman. And I think you would be paying significantly less than that price to acquire him.
I would really like to thank Hadi and Sebastian for their time. You can find them on Twitter. Hadi is Hadi at HadiK_scouting. Sebastian is at Hi_Sebastian. You can also find us on Twitter at LO_Canadians. Please make sure you're subscribed to this podcast wherever you hear podcasts, as well as on YouTube. You can email us at lockedoncanadians@gmail.com. Please tweet us. Share what you think. Tell your friends about us. If you like this episode, please share it. And in the meantime, our Friday episode is a prospect mailbag. That's right. All your questions that you asked, it's a prospect mailbag coming up for you on Friday.